The year is 1939. Europe stands not merely at a crossroads, but on the precipice of an abyss. The continent is holding its breath, suspended between the ghosts of the Great War and the immense, growing shadow of a new, industrialized conflict. For over 2 decades, the Western world had clung desperately to the fragile promise of never again, an oath forged in the colossal loss of life and the mud-soaked trenches of the Western Front. But that promise was a mere facade, a set of paper treaties meticulously shredded by ambition, and a covenant betrayed by political exhaustion and a profound failure of nerve. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler, having risen to power on the back of German national humiliation and economic despair, the scars left by the punitive Treaty of Versailles and the subsequent years of crippling hyperinflation had systematically and openly set about dismantling the foundational agreements of post-war Europe. His ultimate, grandiose goal was the creation of a greater German Reich and the acquisition of vast Lebensraum living space in the East. This vision demanded the complete subjugation, if not the total elimination, of his immediate neighbors. The entire enterprise was a radical, aggressive reversal of the interwar international order. The Western powers, Great Britain and France, watched this brazen escalation with a crippling sense of confusion and indecision. Their foreign policy was overwhelmingly dominated by the doctrine of appeasement, a political gamble rooted in the desperate hope that each successive territorial or political concession would satisfy the seemingly insatiable appetite of the Third Reich. They believed that Hitler, like a traditional European statesman, merely sought to redress the genuine grievances left over from the First World War. This illusion was shattered, piece by piece. Over the course of the late 1930s, the policy of appeasement was tested and failed repeatedly, confirming Hitler's own contemptuous view of the Allied resolve. It started with the remilitarization of the Rhineland in March 1936, a clear violation of Versailles. The Allies offered only verbal protests. Next came the Anschluss, the forceful, jubilant annexation of Austria in March 1938. Again, the Allies stood aside, unwilling to risk confrontation. The ultimate, and most infamous, failure occurred later that year. In September 1938, the Munich Agreement was signed. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain of Great Britain and Premier Édouard Daladier of France effectively abandoned their ally, Czechoslovakia, handing over the strategically vital Sudetenland region to Hitler. This was done in exchange for a piece of paper and Chamberlain's hollow assurance of peace in our time. This act of betrayal, driven by the absolute terror of war and a severe military underestimation of German capabilities, signaled a profound truth to the rest of Eastern Europe. They stood completely alone. The great powers had demonstrated they would not fight for small, geographically exposed nations. This diplomatic triumph solidified Hitler's belief that the West lacked the will to fight. He quickly moved to complete the destruction of Czechoslovakia, and by March 1939, German troops occupied the remainder of the Czech lands, creating the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. The mask had completely dropped, with the map of Central Europe redrawn and his flanks secured. Hitler's gaze locked immutably onto Poland, a proud nation that had only regained its independence in 1918 after 123 years of partition. Poland stood as a critical obstacle to the consolidation of German Lebensraum. The public points of contention were the free city of Danzig-Dosk and the surrounding strip of land known as the Polish Corridor, a crucial access point to the Baltic Sea that physically separated Germany from East Prussia. For Hitler, these were historically German territories essential for unifying his Reich. For Poland, they were non-negotiable symbols of their hard-won national sovereignty, and the Polish government firmly rejected German demands throughout the spring and summer of 1939. The tension mounted day by day. German propaganda, controlled entirely by Joseph Goebbels, whipped the public into a frenzy, fabricating elaborate stories of Polish atrocities against German minorities residing near the border, a total and deliberate reversal of the actual aggressor-victim dynamic. The massive German military machine, the Wehrmacht, was fully mobilized and poised for action, merely waiting for the final, political condition to be met before launching its devastating attack. The fate of Poland, and indeed the world, hung by the thinnest of threads. The mounting political pressure over Danzig and the Polish corridor, though the subject of heated public debate, was merely the superficial layer of the escalating crisis. The true, terrifying mechanism of the invasion was being finalized in profound secrecy, far removed from the tense borderlands. While the world's attention remained fixed on the aggressive demands being issued from Berlin, Hitler was executing the most cynical and consequential diplomatic maneuver of the entire era, securing the neutrality and, indeed, the active complicity of the Soviet Union. For months, the Western powers Great Britain and France had been attempting, with agonizing slowness and bureaucratic hesitancy, to forge an anti-German defensive alliance with Joseph Stalin. These negotiations were doomed from the start. They were plagued by deep-seated ideological mistrust between the Western democracies and the totalitarian communist regime, as well as a fundamental disagreement over the scope of the alliance. Crucially, Poland and Romania, still fiercely guarding their hard-won independence, were staunchly unwilling to grant the Soviet Red Army passage across their territory, fearing that once Soviet forces entered, they would never leave. This diplomatic paralysis on the part of the Allies provided Hitler with a magnificent, unexpected opening. Hitler, meanwhile, acted with ruthless speed and decisiveness. He bypassed the traditional diplomatic protocols and offered Stalin something concrete: territory and an immediate cessation of hostilities. German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop flew urgently to Moscow. On the evening of August 23, 1939, Ribbentrop and his Soviet counterpart, Vyacheslav Molotov, signed the Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, instantly dubbed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Image suggestion: the famous archival photo of the signing closing parenthesis. The announcement of the pact sent a shockwave of disbelief and moral revulsion throughout the democratic world. The two most bitterly opposed ideological regimes in Europe, fascism and communism, had formed a strategic, if clearly temporary, alliance. The public treaty itself was a non-aggression agreement, designed to prevent conflict between the signatories. However, its true, horrifying significance lay within the secret additional protocol that accompanied it. This document, hidden from public view for decades, contained a precise, cold-blooded agreement to divide the territories of Eastern Europe into Soviet and German spheres of influence. The protocol explicitly detailed the political demise and military partition of the independent Polish state, carving it up along the line of the Narew, Vistula, and San rivers. This single, devastating act eliminated the nightmare scenario of a two-front war for Hitler and simultaneously gave Stalin a vast strategic buffer zone and significant territorial gains. With the threat on his eastern flank neutralized, the final preparations for the invasion of Poland were accelerated. Yet, despite this comprehensive strategic preparation and the guaranteed silence of the Soviet Union, Hitler felt a burning compulsion to manufacture a final, unassailable pretext for his aggression. He could not, for the purposes of domestic propaganda and international public relations, simply be seen to invade without a cause. He therefore ordered Operation Himmler, a meticulously planned series of cynical false flag attacks that designed to fabricate evidence that Polish forces had initiated hostilities against Germany. The ultimate aim was to create a compelling, though completely false, narrative that the Wehrmacht was merely exercising its right to self-defense by responding to foreign aggression and border violations. The most notorious and theatrical of these planned incidents was the Gleiwitz incident on the evening of August 31, 1939. Image suggestion: a dark, stark depiction of the Gleiwitz radio tower at night, perhaps a figure in uniform nearby. A small, specialized unit of SS men from the security service SD, led by Sturmbannführer Alfred Naujoks, carried out the central operation. Dressed in Polish military uniforms, they briefly stormed the German radio station in the town of Gleiwitz, now Gliwice, located right near the border. Their broadcast was fleeting and deliberately confusing a few unintelligible words of anti-German rhetoric in Polish, designed to sound like a genuine seizure by Polish insurgents. The final, and most grotesque, element of the deception was the physical evidence left at the scene, to provide irrefutable proof of Polish casualties for the German and international press. The SS used the bodies of concentration camp prisoners, whom they chillingly referred to by the code name Konserven, or canned goods. One such prisoner, dressed in a Polish uniform, was given a lethal injection and then shot multiple times at the scene to simulate a death in combat. This body, presented to carefully selected German press outlets the following morning, a casualty of the Polish attack, became the cornerstone of Hitler's propaganda justification. The German news media immediately went into an overdrive of manufactured outrage, proclaiming that Polish troops had opened hostilities and that the Reich had no choice but to retaliate. The entire charade was completed within minutes, but it was all the excuse Hitler needed to launch his overwhelming invasion. The vast German military machine, poised in position, only awaited the final tick of the clock. With the political theater concluded and the necessary propaganda fabricated, all that remained was the terrifying military execution. The massive German invasion force, divided into Army Group North and Army Group South, was poised and waiting along the extensive 1,750-mile Polish-German border. The final military command, known as Operation Case White Fall Weiss, was issued, confirming the devastating timeline. The air was thick with the chilling silence before the storm, a silence that was shattered in the early hours of the morning. The date is September 1, 1939. The time is 4:45 a.m. The opening salvo of the Second World War was fired not by a land force, but from the sea. Image suggestion: the Schleswig-Holstein firing, smoke billowing from its guns. The aging German pre-dreadnought battleship Schleswig-Holstein had been anchored deceitfully, a Polish military base on the Westerplatte Peninsula in Danzig under the flimsy pretense of a courtesy visit. At the prearranged time, its heavy 28-centimeter guns unleashed a devastating barrage. The shells rained down on the Polish military transit depot, a tiny, isolated outpost defended by a mere 200 Polish soldiers and a few light artillery pieces. Despite being vastly outnumbered, surrounded, and constantly bombarded by sea and air, the Polish garrison, led by Major Henryk Sikorski, refused to surrender. Their heroic, symbolic defense would last a full 7 days, becoming the first great, defiant epic of Polish resistance, confirming the bravery of the nation even as its fate was being decided. Simultaneously, the ground invasion commenced along the entire length of the frontier. The scale of the German deployment was overwhelming. 53 German divisions comprising nearly 1.5 million men were supported by unprecedented concentration of mechanized power, including 2,700 tanks and over 2,000 advanced aircraft. The invasion was orchestrated as a vast, converging maneuver, with Army Group North driving from Pomerania and East Prussia, and Army Group South advancing from Silesia and Slovakia, aiming to meet deep within the Polish heartland and encircle the main Polish forces west of the Vistula River. This was the world's first sustained experience with the terrifying doctrine of the Blitzkrieg lightning war. It was a revolution in warfare, utterly discarding the static, attritional trench warfare that had defined the previous conflict. The Blitzkrieg was surgical, swift, and brutal. It relied on coordinated, deep penetration strikes by integrated panzer armored divisions and motorized infantry, supported relentlessly by the Air Force, the Luftwaffe. The goal was not merely to advance, but to shock, paralyze, and completely shatter the enemy's command, control, and communication networks before resistance could be effectively organized. The speed of the armored spearheads, often outpacing their own infantry, created a state of deep chaos, rendering the Polish command system inert. For Poland, the military reality was devastating. Their armed forces, while numerous and courageous, were reliant on outdated equipment, slow mobilization schedules, and a defensive strategy that dangerously attempted to protect the entire frontier simultaneously. Communication relied heavily on fixed lines and vulnerable radio stations. The rapid strikes of the German motorized units smashed through Polish defenses and immediately began bypassing strong points, aiming directly for the logistical centers. Polish units, cut off and encircled, were forced to fight isolated, often hopeless battles. The speed of the German advance ensured that any hope of a sustained, organized defense was extinguished almost instantly. In London and Paris, the declarations of war, which should have been immediate, were delayed by bureaucratic confusion and frantic diplomatic efforts to avoid the inevitable. Finally, on September 3, 1939, 2 days after the initial German attack, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain of Great Britain, in a somber radio address, confirmed to the world that a state of war now existed with Germany. France quickly followed suit. The lines of the conflict were officially drawn, and the war that would soon engulf the globe had formally begun. Yet, despite these declarations, the Western Front remained eerily quiet. While they had declared war, the bulk of British and French forces were instructed to wait behind the formidable French defensive line, the Maginot Line. For the next 8 long months, they would engage in minimal action, dropping only propaganda leaflets over Germany, a period that would soon be scornfully dubbed the Phony War. They were waiting for a war that, thanks to the sheer speed and terror of the Blitzkrieg, was already being rapidly fought and irreversibly lost in the smoking fields and towns of Poland. The West had declared war, but Poland had been left to face the full fury of the Wehrmacht alone. The declarations of war from London and Paris had rung out across the world, but their immediate consequence for Poland was tragically minimal. While the Western Allies settled into the grim, passive inactivity of the Phony War, a period of nervous waiting that would stretch for 8 months, the true, terrifying nature of industrialized conflict was unfolding with shocking speed across the plains of Poland. The Polish campaign, known to the Germans as Fall Weiss, became the proving ground for a revolutionary, brutal new method of warfare. The Polish army, despite its immense courage, found itself utterly unprepared for the sheer velocity and synchronized coordination of the German assault. Poland's military strategy remained tied to the static, defensive doctrines of the First World War. Their plan, designed to hold defensive lines along the entire lengthy frontier, dangerously dispersed their forces and lacked the necessary strategic depth. Their logistical backbone, composed primarily of vulnerable railway networks and fixed communication centers, was instantly targeted and crippled by the opening salvos, preventing effective mobilization. Contrast this defensive stance with the German Wehrmacht, which represented the absolute zenith of military innovation at the time. Their attack was not a traditional infantry advance, but a meticulously choreographed, high-speed assault orchestrated by brilliant, revolutionary strategists, chief among them General Heinz Guderian, the acknowledged father of the German armored corps. The German invasion force of 1.5 million men was not just numerically superior, it was fundamentally hypermobile and designed for deep penetration. The key difference lay in the concept of concentrated, integrated mechanized warfare. The invasion relied heavily on 10 fully equipped panzer divisions. Crucially, these armored units were not viewed as mere support for the marching infantry, as was still the prevailing doctrine in France and Britain. Instead, they were established as independent, fast-moving, devastating battering rams. Their mission was to be relentless, to punch concentrated holes through the enemy's forward line, and then, critically, to keep driving forward, deep into the enemy's rear. This meant bypassing strong points, ignoring resistance at the flanks, and striking directly at the enemy's nerve centers, the headquarters, supply depots, and communication hubs. The Wehrmacht's early tanks, such as the Panzer I and Panzer II, were indeed lightly armored and armed compared to later Allied models. However, their revolutionary effectiveness stemmed from their deployment in mass formations, maximizing the psychological and physical impact of their synchronized attacks. They were coordinated via radio, a decisive advantage that allowed tank commanders to communicate in real time and adapt to battlefield conditions, a capability the Polish forces largely lacked. This coordination ensured the armor, the motorized infantry traveling alongside it, and the supporting artillery moved as a single, devastating fist. This was the pure, paralyzing shock of Blitzkrieg, not just speed, but a total systemic collapse imposed upon the enemy. The consequence for the Polish army was instantaneous chaos. Units were cut off within hours, their commanders unable to communicate with each other or with Warsaw. The forward units, left to fight isolated, desperate battles, were encircled and destroyed piece by the relentlessly moving German spearheads. The Polish defense was desperately fighting the last war. Germany, with its armor, air power, and radio-coordinated mobility, was fighting the next one. This mechanized superiority was the fundamental engine that drove the catastrophic success of Fall Weiss in its opening days. While the German panzer divisions formed the spearhead of the Blitzkrieg on the ground, the crucial element that guaranteed the strategy's success was the absolute and terrifying supremacy of the Luftwaffe. The German Air Force, the Blitzkrieg, was not merely a ground assault. It was a devastating three-dimensional attack where the air component acted as flying artillery, operating in direct, synchronized coordination with the ground troops. The Polish Air Force, despite its professional pilots and brave airmen, was hopelessly outclassed. It possessed roughly 400 operational aircraft in September 1939, many of which were outdated models like the PZL-P-11 fighter and the PZL-23 Karas light bomber. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, fielded over 2,000 modern aircraft, including the formidable Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters and the Heinkel He-111 bombers. On the very first day of the invasion, the Luftwaffe launched massive, devastating strikes against Polish air bases and key industrial centers. Contrary to a widespread myth, the Polish Air Force was not annihilated on the ground, but its command structure was shattered, and its ability to launch coordinated attacks quickly ceased to exist. Polish pilots fought valiantly, achieving some local victories, but they were hopelessly outnumbered, and their losses quickly became unsustainable, with the Polish Air Force largely neutralized. The Luftwaffe was free to turn its attention to the Polish army. This is where the infamous Junkers Ru-87 Stuka dive bomber became the horrifying symbol of German terror. Image suggestion: a Ru-87 Stuka dive bomber with fixed landing gear. The Stuka, with its fixed landing gear and distinctive, spine-chilling screech created by fixed sirens attached to its chassis, known as the Jericho trumpet, was designed to strike with extreme precision. It functioned as a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. These dive bombers relentlessly targeted Polish troop concentrations, railway junctions, bridges, and most importantly, the vital communication lines and command headquarters, ensuring the Polish army could never effectively organize its counterattacks or retreats. The noise of the Stuka dive bombing runs was often enough to break the morale of the Polish infantry. This air superiority ensured that the Polish army was fighting blind, deaf, and alone. Supply columns were bombed before they reached the front, reinforcements were scattered before they could assemble, and senior commanders were isolated from their forward units. The German ground forces were never seriously harassed from the air, allowing their armored columns to maintain their terrifying speed and depth of penetration. The sheer velocity of the German advance was evident within the first week. The Polish defense was collapsing under the weight of the pressure. One of the first major battles that demonstrated this brutal reality was the Battle of Mława, fought near the northern Polish border from September 1st to 4th. Here, Polish forces, despite being relatively well prepared with anti-tank defenses and fortifications, managed to hold the German Fourth Army for several days. However, the relentless application of air power and the constant threat of being flanked by motorized infantry forced a strategic retreat. The German panzers, driving from the north and the south, were moving toward their planned rendezvous point, threatening to encircle the main Polish forces concentrated near the capital. The Battle of Mława, though a temporary Polish defensive success, ultimately showcased the futility of static defense against the dynamic, integrated power of the Blitzkrieg. The strategic situation for Poland was deteriorating faster than anyone in Warsaw, London, or Paris had dared to imagine. Despite the systemic shock delivered by the Blitzkrieg, The Polish forces did not simply collapse. While the speed of the German advance was unprecedented, Polish soldiers and officers displayed immense heroism, often fighting to the last man even when cut off and surrounded. These isolated acts of courage were vital, not only for national morale, but as early lessons in how to counter the German method. The fierce, week-long defense of Westerplatte, though ultimately futile, was just one small, concentrated example of this determined resistance. However, the most significant military response from the Polish army came in the form of the Battle of the Bzura River. This was the largest battle of the entire campaign, fought between September 9th and September 19th, 1939. Recognizing that their forward positions were rapidly being bypassed and encircled, the Polish commanders, primarily General Tadeusz Kościuszko, launched a massive counteroffensive on the central and northern flanks of the advancing German army group south. This was a brave and desperate attempt to slow the German advance on Warsaw, relieve pressure on the capital, and potentially break out of the tightening encirclement. The initial phase of the Battle of the Bzura was surprisingly successful. The Polish Poznań and Pomorze armies struck the exposed left flank of the German 8th Army, achieving a temporary breakthrough. For a brief, agonizing period, the Poles managed to push the Germans back, taking thousands of prisoners and demonstrating that their spirit of resistance was far from broken. This temporary success forced the German High Command to halt its advance toward Warsaw and divert significant armored and air resources to address the threat. This was the first major setback the Wehrmacht had faced in the campaign, and it proved that a coordinated, concentrated attack could momentarily disrupt the Blitzkrieg. Yet, the reprieve was short-lived. Hitler and the German High Command reacted with decisive brutality. They swiftly redirected the full weight of the Luftwaffe, including the ubiquitous Stukas, to the area around the Bzura River. The battle turned into a colossal aerial bombardment. German air power systematically destroyed Polish bridges, supply lines, and troop concentrations, making maneuver and sustained defense impossible. The battlefield became a killing ground, an apocalyptic landscape where Polish soldiers, lacking air cover, were relentlessly hammered from above. The Polish troops, now entirely surrounded by 5 German divisions, fought bravely for 10 days, but the mechanized jaws of the German pincer movement closed inexorably. By September 19th, the remaining Polish forces at the Bzura were annihilated, captured, or forced to retreat in small, disorganized groups toward Warsaw or the Romanian bridgehead. The Polish army lost approximately 120,000 men in this battle alone, either killed or captured. Strategically, the Battle of the Bzura was a catastrophic defeat, but it was a testament to the Polish will to fight. It briefly disrupted the timetable of the German offensive and confirmed that sheer will was no match for the integrated mechanized might of the WEHRMACH. As the Battle of the Bzura concluded, the German forces were already tightening the noose around Warsaw. The fate of the capital and the remaining Polish resistance now hung precariously in the balance, awaiting the final, inevitable hammer blow. The entire western half of Poland had been overrun, but the deepest betrayal was yet to come. The stage was set for the dark realization of the secret pact signed weeks earlier in Moscow. As the devastating Battle of the Bzura River drew to its bloody close around September 19th, the German Blitzkrieg had achieved its primary military objective, the destruction of the main body of the Polish field army west of the Vistula River. The campaign was entering its final, brutal phase, centered on the capital, Warsaw. The siege of Warsaw officially began as early as September 8, 1939, when German armored units, moving with terrifying speed, first reached the city's outskirts, while the tanks' initial attempts to enter the city were repulsed by determined Polish infantry and quickly assembled anti-tank defenses. A small but critical tactical victory. The strategic situation for the capital was hopeless. The city, a key political and cultural symbol, quickly became a focal point of fierce, desperate resistance. The defense of Warsaw was led by General Valerian Chuma, a veteran of previous conflicts, who rallied every available soldier, police officer, and civilian volunteer into a cohesive fighting force. The defenders numbered over 100,000 men and women, fighting not for victory, but for time and dignity. The resistance was ferocious, forcing the German High Command to halt its mobile armored thrust and settle for a deliberate, destructive siege. Hitler himself was eager to capture the capital quickly, viewing it as a necessary political symbol to finalize his conquest. From mid-September onwards, the city endured relentless shelling and aerial bombardment that shocked even hardened military observers. The Luftwaffe, having secured total air superiority, pounded Warsaw mercilessly. Residential areas, historical buildings, waterworks, and power stations were targeted indiscriminately in an attempt to break the civilian will to resist. The sheer scale of destruction was intended to send a clear message: submission or total annihilation. The defenders, however, dug in, using the ruins as fortifications, fighting fiercely from house to house and street to street, turning the urban landscape into a deadly, improvised fortress. The courage displayed by the inhabitants and defenders of Warsaw became a legend, a final act of national defiance against overwhelming odds. However, the final blow to Polish hopes did not come from the West, but from the East. It was a military and moral catastrophe that signaled the absolute end of the Polish state. In the early hours of September 17, 1939, just as the Battle of the Bzura was concluding and Warsaw was being suffocated, the Soviet Red Army invaded Poland. Without any formal declaration of war, Soviet troops, organized into the Ukrainian and Belarusian fronts, crossed the border, moving into Polish territory under the cynical pretense of protecting the lives and property of the Ukrainian and Belarusian populations in the eastern Kresy regions. This was the dark realization of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact's secret protocol. The Soviet invasion comprised over 460,000 soldiers and massive armored formations. For the remaining Polish forces on the Eastern Front, this act was devastating. The Polish military command had no contingency plan for a two-front war against both Germany and the Soviet Union, especially after the Western Allies had failed to provide any material support. Marshal Edward Rydz-Śmigły, the Polish commander-in-chief, issued an order instructing Polish troops not to engage the Soviet forces unless they were directly attacked, a desperate attempt to avoid turning the Soviet invasion into an ideological war that would only lead to further massacre. The military effect was immediate and catastrophic. Any hope of organizing a sustained defense in southeastern Poland, the so-called Romanian bridgehead, where Polish units were meant to regroup and await Allied support, was instantly eliminated. Units that were attempting to retreat eastwards to join the main force were now caught in a devastating pincer, forced to surrender to either German forces in the west or Soviet forces in the east. The moral impact was equally crushing. The nation had not only been abandoned by its supposed allies, but was now betrayed by a historic enemy acting in collusion with the aggressor. The Soviet invasion on September 17 sealed the fate of the Polish state, transforming a devastating war into a total catastrophe. The Polish military command, realizing the strategic hopelessness of fighting on two fronts, issued orders to retreat southeast toward the so-called Romanian bridgehead. The intention was to avoid engaging the Red Army where possible, save remaining organized forces, and move them out of Poland to continue the fight abroad alongside the Western Allies. This strategic maneuver became a frantic, desperate race for survival. As the Polish army units attempted to move, they were often caught between the rapidly advancing German armored spearheads from the west and the massive columns of Soviet tanks and infantry moving in from the east. In many areas, the confusion and bitterness of this two-pronged assault led to devastating skirmishes. While Marshal Rydz-Śmigły had ordered minimal engagement with the Soviets, isolated battles did occur, particularly where Soviet forces attempted to disarm or capture Polish garrisons. The most poignant of these fights was the Battle of Kock, the final major engagement of the campaign, which lasted until October 6, 1939. Here, the independent operational group Polesi, under General Franciszek Kleberg, fought against both Soviet and German units before finally surrendering due to a complete lack of ammunition and supplies. Meanwhile, the heroic, brutal siege of Warsaw was drawing to its inevitable conclusion. Despite the defenders' ferocious resistance, the relentless aerial and artillery bombardment had reduced much of the capital to rubble. Food, water, and medical supplies were exhausted, and the German forces were tightening the cordon inexorably. On September 27, 1939, the Polish garrison of Warsaw formally surrendered. The capital had held out for nearly 3 weeks, long past any rational military expectation, providing a powerful moral symbol to the Polish people who would later form the backbone of the resistance movement. Shortly after, the fortress of Modlin, which had also resisted fiercely, surrendered on September 29. The last remnants of organized Polish resistance effectively ceased with the surrender at Kock on October 6. In the midst of this military collapse, the Polish government and military high command had to make the excruciating decision to evacuate. On the night of September 17, following the Soviet invasion, President Ignacy Mścicki and Commander-in-Chief Edward Rydz-Smigły, along with thousands of troops, crossed the border into neutral Romania. This was not an act of surrender, but a crucial strategic move to ensure the continuity of the Polish state and its commitment to the Allied cause. They successfully carried with them the national gold reserve, ensuring that the Polish government in exile could be immediately established, first in Paris and later in London. This preserved the legal legitimacy of the Polish state throughout the entire war, allowing Polish units to continue fighting on every major Allied front. The campaign ended with the chilling sight of the two occupying powers consolidating their territorial gains. As per the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, German and Soviet forces met at several points in central Poland, often greeting each other with cynical cordiality. The most infamous display of this wartime partnership was the German-Soviet military parade in Brest-Litovsk on September 22, 1939. Image suggestion: German and Soviet officers shaking hands at Brest-Litovsk. German General Heinz Guderian and Soviet Brigadier Semyon Krivoshein presided over a joint parade that formalized the handover of the city to the Red Army. This grotesque ceremony was a visual confirmation of the secret agreement that had erased Poland from the map. By the second week of October 1939, the Polish campaign was over. The combined might of the German Blitzkrieg and the Soviet invasion had succeeded in a devastating 5 weeks. Poland was partitioned, subjected to brutal occupation, and the Second World War, though declared by the West, had fully commenced, revealing the terrifying blueprint for the global conflict that was to come. The final large engagement of the Polish campaign, the Battle of Kock, concluded on October 6, 1939, with the surrender of General Franciszek Kleberg's independent operational group Polesi. With this final act, the last organized military unit of the Polish army ceased its resistance. The entire territory of the Polish state, independent for barely 2 decades, was now under the complete, joint, and merciless control of the two most brutal totalitarian regimes in Europe. The campaign that would forever alter the course of world history had lasted a devastating 5 weeks. The physical conquest was merely the prelude. The next step was the political and legal dismemberment of the Polish nation. While the fighting was still raging in the central sector, the Third Reich and the Soviet Union finalized their collaboration. On September 28, 1939, a new agreement was signed in Moscow, the German-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Demarcation. This document officially cemented the destruction of Poland, a sovereign state, and definitively fixed the boundary line between the two occupying powers, a line that almost perfectly adhered to the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This demarcation line, running roughly along the Narew, Vistula, San, and Bug rivers, was far more than a mere geographical boundary. It was a frontier of fate for millions of people. Germany gained control over approximately 188,000 square kilometers of territory, home to roughly 22 million people. The Soviet Union, in turn, annexed approximately 200,000 square kilometers of eastern Poland, known as the Kresy region, where some 13 million people resided, encompassing significant ethnic Ukrainian, Belarusian, and, crucially, Polish populations. The German occupation regime was immediately and ruthlessly divided into two distinct zones, each with a different but equally destructive purpose. The western and northern regions of Poland, including Pomerania, Silesia, and Greater Poland, were immediately annexed and directly integrated into the German Reich. The goal here was nothing less than the rapid and complete ethnic cleansing of the Polish and Jewish populations to prepare the ground for German settlers, a core component of the Nazi Lebensraum ideology. In these annexed territories, Polish language was forbidden in public, Polish schools, theaters, and libraries were shut down, and the property of Poles and Jews was summarily confiscated. The central part of the occupied territory, which included the ruins of Warsaw, Krakow, and Lublin, was cynically transformed into the General Government Generalgouvernement. This territory had no pretense of sovereignty. It was established as a brutal colonial police state, governed solely by a German administration based in Krakow. Hans Frank, one of Hitler's most ruthless lawyers, was appointed as the Governor-General. His stated, singular purpose was to convert this territory into a mere reservoir of raw materials and cheap, disposable labor for the Reich, and a dumping ground for the undesirable Polish and Jewish populations being expelled from the annexed territories. Life for Polish citizens was immediately reduced to a status akin to serfdom or slavery. Both occupying powers simultaneously launched systematic campaigns of terror aimed specifically at the destruction of the Polish elite, the intelligentsia, clergy, and former military officers who could potentially lead a future resistance movement. On the German side, this campaign was codenamed the Intelligence Action Operation Intelligence Action. It involved mass arrests and executions of priests, teachers, university professors, lawyers, and reserve officers. The goal was to decapitate the Polish nation, leaving behind only an uneducated, subservient workforce. Tens of thousands of Poles became the initial victims of mass Nazi executions in regional forests and fields, while many others were funneled into newly established concentration camps, such as Dachau, which quickly filled with Polish professionals and intellectuals. Concurrently, in the eastern territories annexed into the Ukrainian and Belarusian Soviet Socialist republics, the Soviet regime launched an equally severe process of Sovietization and class cleansing. The Soviet goal was to eradicate any vestige of Polish statehood, culture, and especially the established class structure. This included the immediate nationalization of industry and large land holdings, along with the total persecution of the Catholic Church. Mass arrests of Polish officers, state officials, police, landowners, szlachta, and intelligence personnel began instantly. These individuals, whom the Soviet authorities deemed class enemies and political threats, were subjected to summary imprisonment, forced deportations to the Gulag labor camps in Siberia and Kazakhstan, or, as the world would tragically discover later, murdered in unimaginable numbers. The 1939 occupation of Poland was not merely a military conquest, but the terrifying launch of an organized, ideologically driven campaign of cultural and physical annihilation against its people. While the Polish Land Army was being dismantled by the converging axes of the Nazi and Soviet forces, the Polish leadership took crucial steps to ensure the continuity of the state and its contribution to the Allied cause. On the night of September 17, 1939, following the devastating Soviet invasion, the President, Ignacy Mścicki, the Commander-in-Chief, Marshal Edward Rydz-Smigwy, and key members of the government crossed the border into neutral Romania. This was not an act of surrender, but a desperate, strategic maneuver to prevent the state from being legally extinguished. They also successfully transported the vast majority of the national gold reserve, ensuring that the government would have the financial means to continue operating abroad. This immediate evacuation preserved the legal legitimacy of the Polish state. Almost immediately, the Polish government in exile was established in Paris and later moved to London after the fall of France. The government in exile, first under President Władysław Wojciechowicz and later, under Prime Minister General Władysław Sikorski, became the unwavering voice of occupied Poland. Crucially, they swiftly began organizing the Polish armed forces in the West. Thousands of Polish soldiers and airmen who managed to escape through Romania, Hungary, or the Baltic states regrouped in France, eager to continue the fight. This decision ensured that Poland remained a recognized, active, and highly motivated member of the Allied coalition throughout the entire conflict. Despite the total loss of its home territory on the occupied soil, even as the terror of the intelligence action and the Soviet deportations began, the spirit of resistance was already stirring. The remnants of the Polish army, military reservists, and patriotic civilians immediately began to form the first clandestine cells of the Polish underground state Polski Państwo Podziemne. This structure, which would grow to be the largest underground resistance movement in all of occupied Europe, was unique. It was not just a military resistance. It was a comprehensive shadow state that operated within a legal administration, courts, education system, and propaganda network, all linked directly to the government in exile. The first official military branch of this state was the Service for Poland's Victory Służba Wojska Polski, SCP, established just weeks after the surrender. The war was lost on the battlefield, but it was far from lost in the hearts and minds of the Polish people. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, the silence was deafening. Despite issuing formal declarations of war on September 3rd, Great Britain and France settled into a period known to history as the Phony War or the Blitzkrieg Sitting War. For 8 long months, from the surrender of Poland in October 1939 until the German invasion of France in May 1940, the major powers of Western Europe engaged in minimal military action against Germany. They dropped propaganda leaflets, mobilized troops slowly, and relied almost entirely on the supposed impenetrability of the Maginot Line. France's massive chain of fortifications. This lack of action proved to be a catastrophic strategic blunder. The Western Allies failed to exploit Germany's temporary weakness following the Polish campaign, during which much of the Wehrmacht's heavy equipment was tied up in the east. They made no serious attempt to attack German industry in the Ruhr or to relieve pressure on Poland. Their military inaction allowed Hitler to consolidate his gains, re-equip his forces, and transfer the vast majority of his veteran divisions from the east to the west in preparation for the next phase of the war. The Phony War was a period of grim, quiet advantage for the Third Reich, a time of preparation paid for by the sacrifice and isolation of Poland. The swift, brutal campaign in Poland had ended, but the true global conflict, fueled by diplomatic failures and tactical errors, was only just beginning. The conclusion of the Polish campaign in October 1939, while marking the end of the initial military phase, was merely the catastrophic beginning of the Second World War. The swift, brutal victory served as an absolutely crucial laboratory for Hitler's war machine, confirming the viability of the Blitzkrieg doctrine and providing a terrifying strategic blueprint for the invasion of Western Europe that would follow. The world, though initially stunned by the speed of Poland's collapse, was forced to confront 3 brutal realities confirmed by the campaign. First and foremost was the undeniable, lethal effectiveness of the Blitzkrieg. The Polish defeat proved that massed, mobile armor, coordinated via radio and operating in perfect sync with overwhelming air support, could utterly paralyze a conventional, static defense. The Polish army's reliance on linear defenses and slow mobilization was crushed by the sheer velocity of the German mechanized spearheads. Western military observers, including those within the French and British General Staff, were watching, but their immediate conclusions were fatally flawed. They mostly dismissed the Polish defeat as a consequence of Poland's supposed backwardness, tragically failing to recognize that the new German method could equally shred the sophisticated but defensively minded French and British armies. General Guderian and his armored divisions had shown the world how to win the next war, yet the Allies stubbornly prepared to fight the last one. Secondly, the Polish campaign completely altered the geopolitical map of Europe and confirmed the sinister, nature of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the joint invasion and subsequent partition proved that the Nazi and Soviet regimes were not merely avoiding conflict with one another, they were actively conspiring to dominate Eastern Europe. The visual confirmation of this partnership, such as the joint parade in Brest-Litovsk, sent a chilling message to the remaining neutral states and confirmed to the Polish people that their betrayal was absolute. This alliance of dictatorships immediately created a new and terrifying geopolitical order, strengthening both parties in their respective spheres of influence. Hitler secured vital raw materials from the East, while Stalin gained strategic depth and territory. The political consequences of this alliance were immediate and devastating for the Polish people. For the Soviet Union, the newly acquired territory was immediately subjected to mass deportations and political extermination under the banner of Sovietization. For Nazi Germany, the conquest provided the first major testing ground for the ultimate goal of the Nazi regime: genocide. The campaign against the Polish intelligentsia, the intelligence action, was a direct precursor to the wider, more systematic horrors of the Holocaust and the Generalplan Ost. The Polish territory was immediately transformed into a laboratory of racial and political terror, establishing the police state mechanisms and the brutal administrative framework, most notably the general government, that would be used across occupied Europe. The successful, swift dismemberment of Poland also decisively ended the period of appeasement in Western Europe, exposing its failure for all to see. Although Britain and France had declared war on September 3rd, their inaction during the subsequent weeks irrevocably damaged their moral standing. They had issued a guarantee to Poland, but had failed to provide any material defense or tactical relief, leaving Poland to fight alone against two great powers. This failure would fuel deep resentment within the Polish government in exile and among the Polish troops who had managed to escape, fostering a determination to fight that would see them serve with exceptional distinction on every subsequent front of the war. From the Battle of Britain to Monte Cassino, the Polish campaign, ultimately a devastating defeat forged in the catastrophic failure of international diplomacy and military doctrine, left an indelible mark on the course of the Second World War. It was the first act in a global tragedy, but its consequences extended far beyond the battlefield. The campaign provided the Axis powers with crucial momentum and exposed fatal flaws in the strategic thinking of the Western Allies. The immediate geopolitical legacy was the emergence of a new, massive line of contact between the two totalitarian giants. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, though cynically presented as an alliance of convenience, created a temporary stability in the East that allowed Hitler to focus his entire military machine westward. The resources, oil, and grain flowing from the Soviet-controlled sphere allowed Germany to completely disregard the British naval blockade and prepare for the next, much larger campaigns, the invasion of Denmark and Norway, and crucially, the ultimate showdown with France and Britain in the West, the failure of the Western Allies during the phony war to launch any serious offensive that might have pressured Germany, while its troops were tied up in Poland, remains one of the great strategic missed opportunities of the early war. However, the deepest legacy of the Polish campaign was the unbroken spirit of the Polish nation. Despite the crushing military defeat in the double occupation by two genocidal regimes, the Polish state refused to die. The successful evacuation and establishment of the government in exile guaranteed Poland's legal continuity and its seat at the Allied table. More profoundly, the spontaneous formation of the Polish underground state with its home army Armia Krajowa and shadow administration created a level of organized, sustained resistance unmatched anywhere else in occupied Europe. This wasn't merely guerrilla warfare. It was the institutional preservation of statehood, culture, and law, ready to fight for liberation from within. The military remnants of the campaign ensured that Polish soldiers and airmen would become a vital, hardened component of the Allied forces. Polish pilots would fly with exceptional bravery during the Battle of Britain. Polish warships would escort convoys across the Atlantic, and Polish ground forces would fight with fierce determination across North Africa, the Middle East, and finally in Italy. Culminating in the heroic capture of Monte Cassino in 1944, Their presence on every major front was a constant, living reminder to the world that Poland had been the first to stand against the aggressor, and its people were determined to be present for the final victory. In closing, the invasion of Poland was more than just the opening chapter of the war. It was a devastating prelude to industrialized murder. It was the training ground for the Blitzkrieg, the proving ground for the general government, and the initial stage for the Holocaust and the Soviet Gulag. The swift collapse did not, however, lead to submission. It led to a profound, desperate, and enduring commitment to freedom. When Hitler ordered the invasion on that quiet morning of September 1st, 1939, he expected a brief, localized conflict. What he unleashed instead was a total war, a global cataclysm, and the birth of a resistance movement that would inspire the world for years to come.